Welcome back to another episode of Road to Rapid Top 1000, the series in which I play rapid games with a time control typically 15 minutes, 10 seconds increment, with the goal of reaching the top 1000 leaderboard on chess.com. And on this episode, I have two very different games in terms of my performance. The first game, as you're going to see, I performed very well and had a crushing victory, and in the second game, it was the entire opposite. So in the first game, I was playing against someone with a very similar rating, and he opened with e4. And in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of skip through the opening because it's not super important. But anyway, I played the Philidor, and we have d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight d7, and he goes for an aggressive f4. We have e5, this is pretty much all theory. And now I decide to fianchetto on my bishop. Not going to go the other way, so makes sense to put it here. He castles, I castle. We have bishop f3. He's already defending this pawn as he knows it's about to get attacked heavily. And so after rook e8, rook e1, I go for c6, which may look like it's opening the queen, which it is, but more importantly, it's kind of protecting the d5 square. But he kind of thought that it was more to open up the queen, and in anticipation of my queen arriving on b6, and attacking the king this way, he simply took his king away on h1, which is kind of a useful move, and sometimes it makes sense to make prophylactic decisions and anticipate what your opponent does in the future. But in this case, it's kind of a waste, and I'm able to capitalize on that a few moves down the line. So here I played a5, because what I want to do is eventually put my knight on c5 and attack this pawn, but if I were to do so immediately, I know that he can just play b4, and my knight's just going to have to retreat to where it was originally. So I played a5 first, and he responded with a4. So he's kind of mirroring what I'm doing, but he's not really stopping my plan. So here's knight c5. And I'm not really prepared to take the pawn yet, of course, because I have 1, 2, 3 attackers, but he has 1, 2, 3 defenders. But this pawn is under a lot of tension, and he has to be careful. And actually, at this point, my opponent was already struggling to come up with ideas, because the most natural-looking move for white here would be bishop e3, but of course, it blocks the rook from the defense of the e-pawn, and I could simply take. So if you can't put the bishop there, this doesn't look very appealing. Queen doesn't really have any great spots to move, so white is already kind of stuck, and he played here the move rook a3, which seems kind of odd, and it definitely is. I think perhaps his idea was to play knight b3 and try to trade off my good knight, and then maybe his rook would end up on b3 and eye this pawn. But it's kind of a slow plan, not very threatening. And here, although I haven't really completely finished developing, my bishop hasn't moved yet, neither has my queen, so my rooks aren't connected, but I was already starting to think of an attacking plan. And after a little bit of consideration, I set this into motion by playing the move h5. Now what this move does is starts to control the g4 square, and we might have a piece there pretty soon. And of course he replies with a natural move, h3, just guarding the g4 square. But now I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And after thinking for a few minutes, I played a very, very nice move here. But before I show you what that move is, pause and try to find it yourself. So the move that I played here is knight to g4. Looks crazy. It's putting the knight directly in the way of the pawn, but my opponent correctly did not capture this knight, as that would be nearly suicidal. I'll just show you what happens. So if the knight is captured, suddenly the king is wide open, and I'm able to infiltrate with my queen with check. Only move is to play king g1, and now my original consideration was actually to take this pawn. That's what I was going to do. But then after this kind of unfolded, I realized that there is an even stronger move here that practically wins the game. Bishop takes d4 check. And not only am I getting the piece back, but it actually can't be captured, because if the queen takes the bishop, the rook drops. The queen is kind of tied to protection of the rook. And what else does white do? He can't move his king here because that allows mate in 1. meaning the bishop would have to block, and now I can just take, and after rook takes, take this pawn, and now I'm on the attacking, I'm up a pawn, and just a great position for black. So my opponent did not take the knight. Instead, he moved his queen, because the other threat is for me to play knight to f2, which forks his king and queen. So he played the move queen to d2, of course, defending the f2 square, but this simply allows my queen to infiltrate with queen to h4. And again, I'm sort of threatening knight f2, but I'm also just putting a lot of pressure in his position. Of course, bishop takes knight is once again a threat. For example, if he makes some move like b3, looking to maybe get this bishop out, I can just pick up this knight, and the queen can't really take because it's tied to the protection of the rook. And here he was already under immense pressure, and he kind of cracked. What he should have probably done is play rook to f1, just get the rook out of the way of the queen, so that I can't just take and win a piece. But he was already a little bit thrown off. Of course, it's a lot easier to attack than to defend and come up with strong defensive moves. So he played the move e5, looking to just block off my bishop so that I can't take the knight. But of course, I can simply pick up this pawn, which I did. And after I took, he now decided to retreat his knight to just defend the f2 square. But as you're seeing, his pieces are starting to go in reverse instead of forward, and that just leaves more space for me to push forward. So now, how did I continue my attack? Well, if you're thinking simply take the knight, you are very mistaken, because that now hangs the rook on e8. Gotta watch out for those pins. So in order to make sure that the rook would be protected, I simply played bishop to d7. And now I'm preparing to take the knight on the next move. And so he has to do something. He takes the pawn, but this just allows me to take with the bishop, and now basically a new attacking piece has entered the game. The bishop is slicing towards the king, in addition to my queen and knight, which are already in a very good attacking position. And like I said, very tough to come up with defensive ideas for white. Already a very bad position. He decided to just eliminate the knight, but after bishop takes, I take with a pawn, and now this pawn is under severe fire. And now, again, he was just really not sure what to do. Very hard to defend this position. The best defensive move is probably something like this, to just swing the rook over and create a pin here. But he didn't do that. He instead played knight to e2, sending another piece backwards. And this just allows me to basically finish the game with the move knight to e4, which essentially takes advantage of his clumsy pieces, which are all bunched up, and now his queen is hit, and he has no way of moving his queen where it will still defend the rook, which is, of course, under fire from the queen. So in this position, he tried one last move, g3, just desperately hoping that I'll take his queen, and then he'll be able to take my queen. But of course, I can simply take on h3 with check, and after this move, my opponent resigned. He's losing a queen, his king is under severe fire, everything just fell apart for him in a matter of moves. So that, I thought, was a very nice attacking victory. I kind of saw a little attacking opportunity, and I jumped on it, and the game was over before my opponent even knew it. So while the first game was very smooth and resulted in a quick victory, the second game is quite the opposite. And this game I actually played the very next day, so my spirit was quite high after that nice win. And I opened with e4. My opponent went for e6, the French. And we have, after knight c3 and bishop b4, the winnower. And now I went for bishop d2, the so-called finger slip variation, kind of a dubious line. And I actually featured a game in this exact line on a previous episode from the series. I believe it was episode 3 or 4. And that game kind of did not end well for me, because this opening is very dynamic, and if you make a little mistake, it can be easily punished. And so here my opponent took the bishop, and after I took, he now takes the pawn, thinking that he's just a pawn up, but now comes queen to g4, which forks the e-pawn and the g-pawn. So he plays knight to f6, defending the e-pawn. Of course, he wants to hold on to his pawn in the center, feeling that it's a little bit more valuable. And after I take on g7, he plays rook g8, kicking my queen back. It goes to h6. And now he plays knight to d7. And now already, as of move 8, we have a very imbalanced position, because I have the two bishops, he has two knights, he has doubled e-pawns, one of them is kind of lodged in my center. I can castle queenside already, but my kingside isn't developed. So if you're playing white here, what do you think your focus should be? Well, I think that the focus should be to get the king to safety as quickly as possible, develop the rest of your pieces, and then kind of go from there. But in this game, I got a little bit carried away. And so here I played the move f3, which is actually a pretty good move because it looks to trade off black's very nice pawn in the center. For example, if the pawn takes, then I can take and develop my knight at the same time. And now I don't have to deal with this thorn in my center anymore. I can then just develop the bishop, castle, and I'm going to have a good game. But of course my opponent doesn't have to take. And here he played b6, looking to develop the bishop to b7 and protect his pawn. And at this point, again, king safety is important, especially when your center is quite open. And what I really should have done was long castle. Simple move, but of course it gets the king more to safety, and now the rook is on a potentially very nice file. Instead, I saw this move b6 and felt like it was bad for black because the light squares became kind of weak, so I played bishop b5, which creates a pin against the king, but at the same time it's neglecting my own king safety. And here he simply played bishop b7, and I thought that by having this pin and this pressure against his pieces, I was much better. But boy was I wrong. And here for a while I sat here thinking of a way to kind of capitalize on the pressure, but I couldn't really come up with anything. I ended up taking this knight, thinking that he would have to take with the king, because if he takes with the queen, he loses the knight, and if he takes with the knight, then he simply loses this pawn, and that allows me to have a passed h-pawn. But to my surprise, after bishop takes d7, he simply did take with the knight, and I took this pawn, thinking that, okay, I'm a healthy pawn up now, I have a passed pawn, things are looking up. But now, my opponent punished my recklessness with a very nice move, queen to g5. And actually, besides that, he simply could have just taken on g2. And this check doesn't really mean a whole lot because it can easily be blocked. But instead, he played queen to g5, and immediately after this move was played, I had realized that I made a big mistake, because not only is the queen defending the rook and putting pressure on g2, it's also slicing this way, meaning that I can no longer castle, because I would end up in check. And I'm already in big trouble here. My pawn is hit, I haven't finished developing, so if I simply move the knight, then I lose this pawn, and then this pawn is going to fall because my rook is under attack. Everything is just quickly collapsing because I neglected my development. So in this position, I tried a desperate kind of move, f4. Now, of course, he can't take because his rook then falls, but he simply took on g2. And now I castled long, but it's already too late. Very bad position for me. Of course, he didn't take the rook right away because then I take it once again, but he simply made a patient move, long castling himself, and now we see a big problem. My rook is under attack, and the only way to save it is to move the knight. But I can't move it to e2 because then queen takes, so I tried moving it to h3, but now here comes rook h8. Now, attacking my queen, but also x-raying and hitting the knight. And after queen takes f7, I'm simply down a piece. And from this point on, it's just an uphill battle. I tried a little trick with d5, now opening up an attack against the rook, but my opponent gladly gave up his rook for my bishop, and now he has a knight, a bishop, and a very strong center against my two rooks, and this is just not enough for me to be able to fight back. The rest of the game is just basically a wash as he pushes his pawns up. I desperately try to fight back, but his center is simply too strong, and eventually he maneuvers his pieces in, and at this point I actually gave up my rook for his knight because I saw that, first of all, his knight is threatening to come in and fork, and also his bishop is threatening to attack my king. It's just a very bad position. I tried to sacrifice the rook to create some counterplay, but I quickly realized that there is simply nothing I can do. This move, he took the pawn, and he also guarded against this check that I was trying, so in this position I actually resigned, and I was very disappointed with myself after this game because I neglected such fundamental principles as development and king safety, and on such a level, those principles get punished, or neglecting those principles, I should say, get punished very easily. So I think the takeaway from these games are, it kind of shows the benefits of developing, getting your king to safety, and then looking for attacking opportunities as opposed to trying to attack when you're not ready and your own king is vulnerable. So, hope those 2 games showed you some stuff. Hope you're able to take something away, and good luck implementing these ideas in your own games.